Hello, boys and girls of Credit Union Land, and welcome to the 22nd episode of the CUInsight Experience. My name is Randy Smith. I am one of the co-founders and the publisher of CUInsight.com, and it is my job on the show to have conversations with the best and the brightest from around the credit union community. And sometimes outside of Credit Union Land. The goal is always the same, to find a few nuggets that we can all learn from. Today's guest is Mr. Bradley Leimer. Brad is the co-founder of Unconventional Ventures. We had a chance to sit down at Co-op Think in Miami Beach before his presentation. Brad works with startups in the fintech ecosystem and mentors entrepreneurs. He's made a career of connecting traditional financial institutions to the fintech world. He believes deeply in bringing diversity into that ecosystem, and that if anybody with a great idea should have a chance to succeed. If you don't follow Brad on Twitter, at Leimer, you should. He is one of the most respected thought leaders in fintech. I've followed him for probably a decade and was really looking forward to getting a chance to have this conversation with him, and it didn't disappoint. I had so many questions for Brad. We talked about disruption and the relevancy of traditional financial institutions going forward. We talked about fintech and credit unions and banks all playing together. We talked about data and AI and how credit unions and banks need to flip the way they look at business as usual and make it more member-centric. There was talk about what he's seeing outside the U.S. and what's coming our way that we need to be prepared for. As we do in every show, I asked Brad about leadership and life hacks, what he's picked up along the way, and then we wrapped it all up with the rapid-fire questions. This was a lot of fun. The dude is so full of knowledge when it comes to the future of our space. I could keep going on, but I won't. So without further ado, I give you my conversation with Mr. Brad Leimer. Enjoy. Bradley, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today to be on the show. I greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Appreciate being here yourself.
We're down in Miami, so not a bad place to be for Co-op Think. So when people do listen to this, that's where we are recording. There were so many different directions that we could go, and I was thinking about going just from the homework from our conversation. But for people that were unable to attend Co-op Think and hear you speak and hear your keynote, what's the biggest disruption to credit unions or financial services in general that you see coming in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think it's this combination of powers surrounding the credit union and community banking model. It's big tech, it's fintech, it's big banks, it's the sort of Asian super app model that is something that people that don't travel a lot don't get to see. If you just get outside of the U.S. and see how people make payments and see, why payments are sort of central to everything that involves our financial life and what goes on from there, it's changing so dramatically, and it's going to eventually come here.
I spent about a year and a half ago now, I spent 4 months in Indonesia, and I was blown away with, cash was non-existent for the most part, but just the different apps that everybody used in day-to-day life to do basically everything. And when it came from the financial transactions, and on a previous episode, I had Doug Layton from Visa on, and that was something I asked him because, we were talking about, tap to pay and things like that. To me, it seemed like in Indonesia and Australia, at so many places. I'm sure that's kind of what you're talking about.
So one of the guests that I was able to interview at Money 2020 in Asia this year was the founder of Bcash. And so just, to hear about this story of both Bcash and another one of their competitors owning 98% of payments, or to use, to use Grab or to use Didi or to use any of these applications. And then you see somebody, I spent a long flight listening to someone talk about how they use WeChat and Alipay. And they had been in Hong Kong for a number of years now, and they were from the US. And to hear them talk about, making all of their reservations, buying all of their tickets, getting food delivered, having people show up at their house to clean their house. It was like the central focus of their lives was this app, and it was all around the ability to make payments.
The time I spent there was an app there that became that central. It was food delivery. It was having a masseuse come, getting the villa cleaned. So
there you go.
So one of the questions that really came to mind for me when, thinking about that was, Do you see this disruption? Do you see what we're talking about here, the way that payments are changing? Is there a threat to the relevancy of traditional financial institutions?
Yeah, I think the threat is in how relevant institutions below a certain threshold of assets really are. Just last week, I took the 10,600 or so financial institutions in a database, and I looked at their assets, I looked at how many people they served, and I looked at sort of the size and scope and scale. And it's amazing how long that tail is.
I was blown away by the growth that you showed, because I saw the series of tweets that you put out in that, and there seemed to be a correlation between the fastest growing. The one thing they didn't have was branches.
Well, but the branches question is a really interesting one. Credit unions, again, especially those above $1 billion in assets, are thriving, right? So when you look at the difference between banks and credit unions, for the first time this past year, there now are more banks than credit unions in this country. And that's significant just because the consolidation will continue to, when I started in this industry, there were probably almost 20,000 plus, and now there's almost below 10,000.
Yeah. When we started CUInsight, there was over 11,000 credit unions alone, and that was a decade ago,
And now there's like 5,300. Yeah. So there's 116 million credit union members, and that's a great number, and the industry lauds it as like, hey, we're continuing to grow. The challenge is that through that consolidation, is the credit union model going to continue to be as significant in everyday Americans' lives as it has been? And that's my concern for the model, is that communities are starting to be less served by banks that are actually based, or credit unions that are actually based in those communities. And so that's really critical. So I think they'll always be relevant. The question is which size of an institution will be relevant.
Okay. So I was watching, I think it was from maybe Finovate last year that you did an interview, and you had talked about like fintechs working with the financial institutions. And in that particular interview, I think you were talking about, like, instead of trying to go for the top 4 banks, maybe go for 25 or number 50. Is there a place between the credit unions that are going to stay relevant and fintech to work together?
Oh, there's absolutely a place. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is culture. And the other is, this fear of the regulators that they won't be as open to these type of partnerships, but that's, becoming very untrue, right? So not only is regulation globally becoming more open and actually pushing this open banking agenda, but they are in many ways actively encouraging the experimentation around the business model, because they understand that the fewer institutions you have, the less competition you have, and the less value that is derived out of the industry itself. And so I think the concern with the regulators, or at least should be, is that as you see larger and larger tech companies and social networks and everybody else who's a payment company come into this space, we do not want to see 4 or 6 big banks in the U.S. alongside 4 or 5 large payment networks that are really social networks underneath the hood, and no other competition. Imagine a world of, deposit rates and lending rates when that happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay. So what you're saying there, I have a feeling that some of the credit union folks that are listening are going to be surprised to hear you say that the regulators are actually becoming more open to this. Is that globally, or are you seeing that in the U.S. as well?
I see that in both. Okay. I see that open banking regulations, which really started maybe 6 or 7 years ago in Europe and the UK, have rapidly expanded around the world, right? You have in Singapore and Hong Kong and other places this opening up of, wanting to, hey, we're going to have a sandbox for you to develop in. We're going to create open standards for you to be having data shared between institutions. And what's most critical in where the U.S. will likely go is that it will start with the big banks and their lobbying groups saying, this is how we want to do it. And what needs to happen, and what has been happening, is that fintechs have come, I'm going to be part of that conversation. Credit unions and credit union regulators need to be as part of that conversation as anybody else.
So when fintech's coming into this, is it the big fintech companies, or is it, I always, when I think about fintech, I think about what, a PayPal has been able to do in payments and things of that nature. But then there's all the ones, you work with a ton of them, right?
Yeah.
That are that each have something else that they're trying to do. And I've always wondered about that with the lobby. Is it attaching to the bank lobby, or is it trying to change some other rules from, another side? So
yeah, I mean, think about, prior to the CFPB sort of being a political football, I guess. The initial idea was designed to help consumers.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of smaller fintechs actually being involved and being invited to Washington to give their view on how to make sure that the industry continues to be very inclusive. And so, I don't think that there's a size requirement, whether you're an institution, a fintech, a technology company that's in the space. I think it's really about engagement. It's really about knowing what's going on and putting yourself into that conversation.
Getting ready for this conversation, I was reading up on some of the writing and the work that you've done. You've made an entire career connecting banks and, to the fintech ecosystem. What's been the biggest challenges, I guess you would say, when you're mentoring entrepreneurs? What's been the biggest challenge you see working in this, with people in this space? What are the stumbling blocks that fintechs are having when they get started?
Yeah, well, we founded Unconventional Ventures to ensure that everyone had a voice in the changes happening to the financial services industry. And, both my partner and I have been working with startups in different areas of the industry for probably more than a decade. And whether it was in my role at Santander leading innovation in the US or before, I've always sort of been drawn to those entrepreneurs that are trying to change banking for the better. And I think the biggest challenge over, probably now almost 15 years working with smaller companies is the acceptance that what they say and what they're building matters.
I heard you say that before, that you asked the question, like, why does this matter? What are you trying to change?
Right.
Is that what you're talking about there?
Yeah, it's like, so to understand, what drives an entrepreneur and their teams to found a company that is addressing, a 800-pound gorilla. I mean, financial services is ridiculously large and so embedded in everything that our culture does. Money literally moves your entire day. Whether you see it and feel it, money drives everything that you experience during your day. And, the underlying industry that has profited from that last year made $237 billion on the banking side alone. It's important that we have a foil to that, and that includes all of these companies, almost 12,000 plus globally, that are in what we call now fintech. And so the biggest challenge, I think, is for the industry to learn, accept, partner, and understand that most of these companies are not out to take business. They are out to make the banking model more transparent and more fair. And those that aren't quickly get called out. And if you're a company like, Uber, yep, and your equivalent of Uber in the way that they early on were attacking a part of the physical space of banking, you are going to quickly get called out by the ecosystem.
Has that changed at all over, say, the past 5 years? Where are the fintechs looking to partner with the more traditional system? Is it still some are trying to go around it, some are trying to go through? I guess my thought would have been early on, it did seem like a lot of maybe the fintechs that we heard of more were like almost trying to create their own lane, basically.
Well, I mean, so it's tough to take an even, which is helping Walmart employees get paid earlier if they have a financial shortfall, with a SoFi or a Revolut or some of the companies that have run into some trouble when they've scaled.
Yep.
Culture's huge, and as you grow, culture's always going to be an issue. But the challenge, again, is there are going to be a subsegment of these fintechs that have so much venture money and have so much of a impetus to get their investors a return that they're going to try to carve off, a huge chunk of lending, and look again at the challenges that like a lending club or others have had. And so if you do not go about this the right way as you scale, you're not going to have good results if you're a bad company.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was a line that jumped out at me when I was reading an article that you wrote in International Banker, and you were talking about the future model will likely become increasingly less dependent on growing access to data across financial services, commerce, social media, and devices. There was a couple words that stuck out. Financial services isn't necessarily age agnostic. When you're talking about not necessarily being age agnostic, what do you mean by that? Because so often it seems like to me that we hear millennials want this, but we're not even talking about the older generations at that point. And
I think what I was really getting at there was that we are building for segments. We are capturing data for segments across the industry. And we're still so millennial obsessed. And you know, insert younger generation here, because 10 years from now, we'll be talking about Gen Z and whatever else we create. Yeah. I think that you have to see what's being built and step back and say, okay, well, why are we gathering social data in order to create a new credit model, for example, right? How are companies like Experian and others actually looking at alternative data? Well, what they're doing is they're tapping into data sets that tend to skew young. And they tend to skew with up-and-coming apps that tell you an awful lot about social behavior, location, and these other things that define risk. And so where I'm going with that and why I kind of embedding that statement in that article was to really challenge this notion. Because we should be building for all, and we shouldn't be building for segments, because data is age agnostic. You know, a data point of your age tells you one thing, but we age very, very differently from one another.
Absolutely. So there was a question that I was really excited to ask you, and I think you tied right into it. For a long time, I believe that technology, and even something you mentioned earlier here in the podcast, but I believe that technology could be a great equalizer for the smaller financial institutions. I hate to say it, but my viewpoint is almost starting to change on that, where because of data, like whoever has the most may have the opportunity to do the most with it. I guess, do you view technology in the under $1 billion financial institutions as an equalizer or deterrent at this point? And is data changing even all of that, the collection of and what you can do with data?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the data that's the differentiator.
Okay.
I think it's what you're doing with that to define member and customer value. Because what I've always said about financial services is that the customer value proposition, the member value proposition, needs to be flipped. Because when startups create, you know, their decks for their investors and they report, you know, monthly or quarterly about what they're doing, one of those things are, you know, things like, well, how long are our customers going to be with us and what are we going to get out of them? You know, and this is what also banks have done. It's like this net present value somehow of me as a customer. You're going to have me for, you know, 4 years or less, or you're going to have me for 10 years or less. And these are the products that I'm going to try to get you into and what have you. But that's really not what data is telling us today. And it's not the way that data is being used today in other parts of the industry and also around, you know, the globe for those companies like Ant Financial that understand that data is a training mechanism to which to offer more value at lower cost, more efficiently at scale.
I mean, is that just a cultural change when you think of whether it's banks or credit unions, quite honestly?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that banks have been sitting on and credit unions have been sitting on the same type of data in a gold mine of data for decades. If you give me 90 days or 60 days of financial transactional data, I know more about you than your spouse does. You know, if it's like you show me your wallet and I'll show you your values.
Yep.
And this is what now, along with other types of data that comes from the applications on your phone, we are able to put together a profile that will give you a pretty good idea of what you're going to do next.
It seems like the retailers have done a better job than the financial services in this.
Yeah, and there's now companies, including a couple that I've worked with, one's called Piotic, that is actually combining those two pieces of data. Okay. So you know, there's others, you know, we invested in one while I was at Santander that takes images from your phone or takes images from your social feeds and tells you what your aspirations are and actually leverages that in order to get additional products or maybe sell you a vacation to Bali.
To where you want to go,
yeah.
Right? Like if you're posting the picture, if you're always on a TripAdvisor or something. So that's awesome. One question that...
And scary.
It is scary. I mean, to me, that's such an interesting thing. We saw what's happening with Facebook. And, you know,
we could talk about that for an hour.
Yeah. I mean, and that is something that there is a Big Brother Orwellian thing to it. Let's go down that for a minute there.
Okay.
Is this something that you see being a real problem in just the relatively near future for anybody who's collecting data?
Yeah, I mean, I spent the first maybe 10 years of my career in database marketing and taking huge data sets from banks primarily and targeting, you know, very specific data models built around targeting products. Imagine the type of data that people have today.
Right. Yeah.
When the most sort of unforeseen elements of what you're doing in your transaction history, were things that were very predictive of what you would do next. Imagine if you have location, app usage. Facebook has, likes and preferences and connections, most importantly. We've already seen, that social networks can do things that are not necessarily the intended consequences, like what happens with elections and things like this. So, combined bank data with social data, with app use and, real-time sort of ether of data that we're spewing out because we like and click and view and all the rest. We need to be very cognizant of what's happening. And I think what's really challenging for financial services is that companies outside of the industry are doing a much better job of leveraging that data, training models on that data, and really defining the next type of customer value props that banks have no business even being in.
To me, that's something too that, at least I'd say for the past couple of years running around credit union land, everybody knows they have the data, but how to use it and how to use it effectively.
And smaller and smaller companies are getting incredibly good at doing that. Yeah. So, just that's my advice to credit unions of any size is push their technology partners to start to show the value that they are deriving off of that data for them.
Is that something if we often hear in credit unions that it's a little slow to change and, it's maybe a little bit older. By pushing the technology partners to show what they're doing there, is that a good way to even, I guess, maybe just, kind of ignite that change in the powers that be that might be, say, a little slow?
So there's two different paths you could go there, right? You could either go with your existing providers, and that tends to be your core, your payment systems and partners like that. Some of those things come through a CUISO, whether it's a credit card relationship or what have you. The real question is, are you embedded enough in their product line? Are you engaged enough in their digital product roadmap? And do you feel that you have a voice in that? Because you collectively do, right? If there's 5,300 institutions, how many phone calls are you making to other institutions that have the same core? It's not just once a year showing up at a conference and saying, oh yeah, we've got the same core. That's cool. Let's go, have a drink and not talk about business. The reason why people go to conferences shouldn't be how sometimes board directors look at conferences as a vacation.
Where's the location? Right?
That's right. Oh, it's in Miami. Oh, it's in Hawaii. Oh, that's great. You know what? Have conferences where it's not someplace you could sit on the beach and maybe more things will get done.
I just recently I had another guest on the podcast and she's very much involved in the smaller under $100 million type, the credit unions. And one of the things she talked about wanting to see was credit unions actually collaborating with the vendor, like, with the fintechs, with the system partners, like almost group pricing, but almost what you were saying there made me think of that because also to say, hey, give us this, give us this data, give us the, what we need.
So here's the kind of way that I've looked at, working inside institutions. When I was in a credit union for 6+ years, I ran marketing and I ran an awful lot of the technology decisions. When I would come into the initial meetings, my first year, and this was after, 10 years of being in a very, very large sort of technology driven marketing company, I would come into these meetings and I would ask questions, and these guys from the core system companies that we partnered with would ask me afterward, what's your background? Where are you from? Who are you? As if they've never heard some of the questions that I would ask. And that to me was telling me that I was doing something right.
Yep.
That I was challenging them on what they were doing instead of just writing a check. And I can't tell you in the course of 15+ years being inside institutions of different sizes, how many times I have delivered the news to a core provider that I'm leaving you, that I am leaving you for this service and this service and this service. And I'm not negotiating here.
Yep.
I am leaving you because I've been telling you for 18 months that you need to change. And so that's part of how I started having a voice in the space. That's when I discovered that it was important to have more people involved in changing the roadmap for these technology firms because so I'm not going to name names because I have friends at all of these companies and I get to bash them plenty of other places. But when it comes to, a company that has simply been cobbled together by acquisition, where you go from, 10 billion in size and you go to 100 billion or 200 billion, and then you have this monster merger, and then all of a sudden you're like one of the top 5 companies in terms of revenue. And you forget that all of these systems cobbled together still power institutions that are 100 million or 200 million or 50 million or 20 million.
Or 20, yeah.
And then those people somehow don't have a voice to you. That's wrong. That's not serving the industry well. And that's not doing something other than forcing your roadmap and your acquisition to drive the actual roadmap of that institution itself.
How would you recommend credit unions in particular to do that? One side of me is like, you have to be your own champion. Is that a consulting relationship? Is it, that?
I think it's working together with other institutions to have, this is my list, or we're going to move.
Yep.
And this is our plan. And there are plenty of consultants that not only challenge the bills that are going to be due for these upgrades and these type of things that these large cores are asking you to do, but there's another sort of way around that too. There are companies now where fintechs could actually go to companies like ProductFi and SynapseFi and Marqeta and others and say, I want to build an entirely new bank. I want to build the ability to take deposits in, to issue, say, a credit card, to issue a debit card, and I want to be able to do it in a complete agile environment where I can invite 10 or 12 other partners to put value props within my applications. And I want to do it completely outside of my core provider today and build a completely different, completely digital bank. If fintechs can do that, and there are small, app development companies that can do that for you readily using the technology that's available today, then why do the cores not think that a credit union of some sort of size can do that themselves when sometimes it's $250,000 or less, or maybe it's even $100,000 to have an app in the app store that does something very specific that your community needs?
Do you see that being a change in credit unions over the next few years where people start going around the core?
Why not?
Yeah.
There's no need, for that core engine to be the focus of your entire, mission inside that institution.
That is wild. I want to be respectful of your time. I could talk to you about this forever. This is really interesting stuff. I'd like to, in every show, we talk a little bit about just some leadership and life hacks. I would love to pick your brain on a few questions here. You've kind of talked about it, but you're the co-founder of Unconventional Ventures. You had a long career. What inspired you to make this your career path? What got you into banking, credit unions, fintech to start with?
I kind of ran into my first job, right? I got out of Berkeley and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with a marketing degree. And my mom had some friends who were in this company that worked with credit unions and banks, and they worked with their data. And it was, of the many companies, there was FiSign Madison and some of these others that were packaging products together. And I went in there and I said, okay, well, I'll do that for a little while. Well, I ended up doing that for close to a decade. Okay. And I got really, really close to the data.
Yeah.
I honestly thought I was going to, it was getting into around 98, 99, and the Bay Area was just popping with the .coms. And I thought I was going to go that route entirely.
Yeah.
And I remember interviewing at some of these companies that, now some of them are gone. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? Well, it turns out that my first company moved all of its operations down to Tennessee and made my decision pretty easy for me to stay in California. Love Tennessee. It was beautiful. I spent a lot of time there with the transition, but I wanted to stay in the Bay Area. And so it was about the same time that a recession was happening in 2001. And recessions tend to do an awful lot of things for people.
Yeah.
Like make them go and work at a credit union. And I'm going to tell this story this week at Think. But what's interesting about that experience is I would have not ever traded what I learned at that credit union for anything in my career because it really changed my life.
It was interesting. A couple different guests on the show that are on the vendor side of things have talked about the experience that they had in the credit union in the beginning. And always asking that question, basically, like about the member.
Yeah.
It's not our money. It's not our, this is who it's for, is the member. So it's the deliverable. And I know you mentioned quite a few things so far about, did that come from?
Yeah, it really did. There? I was forced to come in and understand banking really quick, understand how to market it, understand how to position a brand around it. And, that was something that I really never thought I would, have to do. But what was great about that is that, I have an education around every part of banking because there were 50 people in an institution serving 25,000 members. And, I could not have a better education than that. And so going from there, I worked at a community bank, which had been 4 generations of ownership in the same family. And
that's a different experience.
Yeah. And now that bank is, soon to be probably 12 billion and they're on their way to 20 and, they have new owners and it was a great bank. But that from the day I walked into it was a different experience than what it was at the credit union. Yeah. And then going to someplace like Santander is, 1.7 trillion in assets. They're a Spanish owned bank. That was a very, very different experience than a 50-person credit union.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So has the inspiration, I mean, obviously the inspiration to get in and then going through that system, what keeps you going each day? What's the inspiration today?
I think the inspiration is to change this industry and take what I learned sort of at the grassroots of it and make sure that people understand that there are still 60 plus million Americans, and we're talking about America here, that are underbanked or unbanked. And of those people that are truly banked, how many of them are actually leveling up from one generation to the next because of, the economic challenges that we all face, regardless of a good economy? There are a lot of people that are still struggling financially, and they don't have to be. Yeah. And so I created this company with my partner in order to have that voice continue to fight that fight and to continue to talk about how, regardless of how well you are off, a lot of that success has to do with luck. And so if we don't build the tools to help level up and take technology as a leveling impact and continue to use that for a force of good in this industry, then why are we even here? Why do we employ millions of people in this space unless we're doing it for the right reason?
Yeah, I agree with you. I found something else when I was doing some research for this where you were talking about that the average American, I think, has 7 different banking relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That, and I was thinking about that in the sense of the underbanked or the non-banked. Is there a place there where fintech is actually helping? I mean, that barrier to entry of walking in and having to be approved and doing all of that.
Yeah.
Like when you think about around the world, the mobile phone is, I mean, it's been such
5.5 billion people have mobile phones today.
Right.
I mean, there are 7 billion phones for 7.5 billion people, but lots of people have 2. But the reality is that, banking continues to fall on the wayside. It continues to sort of disappear. And it continues to be sort of embedded in other experiences where we need to think about the fact that we're not products and services. We're simply part of an embedded experience. And yeah, some of those experiences are very much involved with the traditional financial services model, like buying a house, these type of things. But your day-to-day existence will rapidly continue to be replaced by things that you do in a mobile device and eventually through voice, right? Voice banking and voice everything. And we know that it will eventually have what it is like in the movie Her with like a little thing in your ear. Yep. And eventually that'll be in our ear or in our brain. And we'll be thinking about it and we'll be thinking, okay, can we do this and can we do that? And, it'll give us our limitations based on how much worth we have. As
someone who spends a lot of time at conferences and seems to be terrible remembering people's names, but I recognize faces, I can't wait for that. Where it's just like, them from here. A question I had for you, because I know you travel all over the world. Working with companies, speaking at different events. My team's 100% location independent. That all came from a podcast a few years back, listening to the founder of WordPress, talking about never having an office. Do you have, as even in, even people that I know working in credit unions, there are more and more people working remotely. Any productivity tips that you have for anybody out there who's either in that direction or going that direction?
Yeah, you have to use the tools that are available today and continue to push for those to be better and more connected. I work with people all around the world, and if it wasn't for tools like Zoom and applications like Skype and WhatsApp and WeChat and different ways to share documents and actually edit in real time and that type of stuff, the fact that financial institutions don't let you access not just the social sites and these type of things, which I think there's a lot of learning from, but they also don't leverage Google, right? And they don't have shared docs and they don't trust the cloud yet. And I'm just like, okay, the big banks are already well invested in cloud technology, and yet small institutions don't see that. And that should be their differentiating factor, is the fact that they could actually go and use these tools much quicker.
Yep.
Than big banks can, because think about 250,000 people all of a sudden going to Google Docs versus 100 or 500 people going to it with your smaller institution.
Yep. Oh, I don't know how we would live without Skype and Google Docs. That's
the only thing that really limits you is your mind and what you think you can and cannot do. And so no institution should be fearing the regulator saying, no, you can't use Google Docs.
I absolutely love that. How do you, is it through the technology, or is it using Zoom? Are you a big, like, as far as the video side of it goes, when you're collaborating with teams around the world, or with, the entrepreneurs that you're advising? Is there something to keep that? I know I hear it a lot, right? That, when you're not sitting face to face, you tend to lose a little of that relationship. Is there something that you do there?
Well, I've got some people that I'm mentoring now as part of an incubator that I actually do a weekly call with, and one of them does it via a Zoom.
Okay.
And I look at that and I'm like, okay, I don't need to see you. I know what you look like, but I've never met this guy in person. So it does kind of connect you a little bit, that you could see and sort of read an emotion when you give it advice that, may not be what they want. Yeah. Exactly.
You can see their eyes.
But I think the difference between doing a podcast like this and doing a video chat is significant, because I think when you focus visually on someone that you're watching and listening and learning from, it's different because you get distracted, right? So podcasts are great because you could be doing a run, doing a walk. You could be in an office and just doing other things. We actually have 3 different podcasts.
I was just going to ask you. You have the 3. Let's throw those out there.
I got to push those out.
We will link to all 3 of them too, so everybody should check them out.
So the 3 podcasts that we've started over the last 4 or 5 months, the first one is called Shades of Gray, and it has to do with a focus on us as we age and what that means to financial services. Why aren't we focusing on the 50-plus market? Why aren't we thinking about this tremendously fast-growing and most profitable market that we can be attracting into our institutions and retaining this business? And how does it impact, the way that we think about the future of financial services? Truly, this is a $7.6 trillion opportunity to market and build relationships further with people that are older. And we're just getting older as society. So that's the first one. The second one is called Judge Me by My Cover. And we take authors that have been in the space, like Brett King and Chris Skinner and others, and we get their take on what's happening now. And we ask them, just questions about where they think things are going. And we also often ask them what their favorite books are, which is important. The last one that we just are starting now is called Red Envelope. And it's about how Asia, and we define Asia as more, it's India to Asia to Southeast Asia to, everything on the other half of the world from us.
I was just reading about Japan's aging population.
I spent some time in Japan, and that's going to be a little bit of the focus as well as this podcast, is to think about, how these 3 things blend together. Because when you think about, the Asian model, it's truly everything we're doing here at, a 6 to 10x scale. And so, talking about, launching an application that does well in the US, and then you take that and you apply it to China and the markets in Asia, and you're like, all of a sudden, well, we have 3 billion people just in this space, and getting 200 or 300 million people to use an application very quickly is something that has been done again and again and again. So we're keeping busy. And again, if we didn't have these tools to be able to interview people around the world, the only challenge sometimes is time zones.
Yep.
And you get around that too.
You can get around that as well. We will link to all 3 podcasts, and everybody should go over there and check those out after listening to this one. When you think back earlier in your career, is there a mistake that you made that you're often seeing? I generally ask people, other young leaders, you're working with, entrepreneurs and people that are, in the startup game. Is there a mistake you see people making over and over again?
Yeah, I think the mistake that people make is not learning from the past. I think that people don't appreciate history. And I don't know how many times I hear people like, well, why would I want to know about what happened before? I'm just going to reinvent it anyway, and I'm going to make it better. If you don't at least have an idea of what didn't work, how are you going to improve upon it other than blindly going forward with something that has been done 20 times, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's great that entrepreneurs, think that they can change the world so easily. But that's why you have, people that have a little bit of experience in the space, not to put a guardrail against where you could possibly go. It's more so just, hey, in context, this is what's worked and what's not worked that I've seen in my career.
Yeah, so you don't have to make the same mistakes
That's
over
right.
and over, right? Just kind of one of the other questions I love to ask. Has there been a piece of advice or a life lesson that you received that you find yourself going back to over and over again?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that, appreciate the people that you get to work with today. Because I think teams are more transient than we think. Yeah. But also at the same time, I think the relationships that you make, especially in your 20s and 30s, tend to be the ones that stick around. And I think we all need to get back to that where, if we're later in life and we're making these kind of connections, to appreciate them in the same way that you did when you were younger, to continue to go back to people and, make sure that there's not a way you could help them.
Yeah.
And that's just, about human relationships in general.
Another question I love to ask, how do you make sure your message stays fresh with, you see change probably more than almost anybody else does out there, and when you're talking to, a fintech startup or, somebody that you're advising, making sure that their message is not only stays fresh, it tends to be newer, but has longevity to that message too. Is it something you keep tweaking or?
I think you always, you learn and you adapt. I think the lesson in that is, to keep fresh, you always have to sort of put your eyeballs on paper. And I'm, a huge advocate of reading and consuming and just sucking the marrow out of the information pipe that we have today. And there's no greater pipe than, Twitter. And I've been, having that daily in my life for over a decade. And I could tell you that I've learned so much from not just the information, but the people that I've been able to connect to. That's
where I've heard of you and known of you for years now, is from Twitter and following you. I do have a question. If you have a free day and there's nothing on the calendar, what is it that you do outside of fintech and startups? And do you ever turn off Twitter? Or is it
Yeah, you have to turn off Twitter because you have to spend time with real people, right? And I think oftentimes if I have a day like that, especially if it's on the weekend, I like to spend time with my family. And, I've got two relatively young boys of 6 and 9, and they have such a different, look on the world. And if you can't learn anything by being a parent, you're doing something wrong. So I kind of like, if depending on where I am, it's like I will either, be with them and be doing whatever activities you do when you're 6 and 9. And, my wife and I will go and take them on whatever adventure the day brings. If I'm traveling like this, I will go for a walk in a new city or a walk in an old city to look at it new. I'm a big, fan of experiencing a city by walking it like you would if you lived there.
That's one of my favorite things to do when I travel. So is walk and just look around, observe.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other things, just to kind of throw them in there, is that, I love to read and I love to write.
Yeah.
And I love to, do more of that. And so if I had a lot of free time, I'd probably do even more of both of those things.
You'd read and write more. Last part of the show. So a few rapid fire questions. The questions are rapid. Your answers don't have to be. Do you remember the first time you got into memorable trouble? And you'll share with us. How about that?
Yeah, that I'll share. I think the first time I probably got in trouble was, trying to kill myself by walking around a roof. I recently had this discussion with my brother. When I was 6, in our first house, I think it was, on one side of the house, it was 3 stories. On the other, it was 1. It was kind of like on a hill. And my brother and I love to climb trees. And, we're outside, we're doing stuff in the backyard, and we're climbing trees, and I'm 6, okay? I climb a tree and I get on the roof. And I'm like literally walking around the roof, practically running around the roof. And my brother comes inside the house, he's not paying attention to me. He's a couple years older. He's like, oh, well, my younger brother's on the roof. No big deal.
Right.
My mom hears this and she's like, what's going on? What's going on outside? And my brother said, oh yeah, Brad's on the roof. And she's like, what? And so she comes out and finds me on the roof, gets me down, and she says, you know what? We're going to have to take something away so that you pay attention to the fact that this is not something you ever want to do again, because you could have died. And I'm like, really? I'm 6. Yeah. I don't know about anything like that. But I do remember getting in trouble for that.
What did she take away?
I think she took away everything that I possibly had. At the time, it was probably some sort of action figure.
Absolutely. Do you have a daily routine that if you don't do, your day just feels off?
I do spend an awful lot of time reading the news and reading industry publications. And so I do a little bit of that. I have a collection of websites and obviously Twitter to kind of go through. That helps me with sort of the zeitgeist of the day. It's often too much of a distraction. So I will look at the calendar and kind of get a sense of not just what I've planned for myself, but who I'm going to talk to that day. And I think it's important to put in context with what you're trying to achieve. And so I'm trying to get better and better at sort of structuring
downtime from distractions in order to focus on writing and things like that.
Okay. I was going to say, because you write. So is that something that because you do write quite a bit. Is that something that you block off time for? Is that into your schedule or
I need to do that more. I mean, I try to write a little bit every single day. And my challenge is that there's so many things I want to write on. And there's so many places that sort of give me and provide me the opportunity to write. There's always more to write and more requests to write than I have time for, or make time for. And I think just like reading, you have to make, no more excuses and just plot out that time.
Absolutely. The random question, what's the best album of all time?
That is tough. I actually like most types of music. And so I would like throw in things like, Brian Eno and some ambient artists like Harold Budd. But then you look at classics like the Beatles or Pink Floyd or the Doors or Led Zeppelin or something, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. Some of these old ones that I grew up with in the 70s and 80s. I'm a huge fan of U2. And so I have to pick a U2 album. And I like so many of them, but I would probably say Unforgettable Fire.
Okay.
Because beginning to end, that was something that if I had one album on a deserted island,
that's the one. Huh?
That would be it.
You've talked a lot about reading. I'm also a huge reader. Books all over the house, and most were recommended. Is there a book over time that you've either gifted or that you've recommended that everybody should read?
Yeah, I think there's two that I've given to a lot of people, or at least said that they should read. And one of them is called The Art of Travel by Elaine de Botton. Botton. It's a really, sort of great exploration of why we travel and what our experiences are as we travel. And one of the most poignant, things that he says in one of the chapters, which is really interesting to me because I travel a lot, is that he found himself in a hotel room in a new city, and part of him wanted to just stay in the room.
Yep.
And part of him wanted to go explore. And it was like this yin and yang of this pull of I'm exhausted, but I want to go and see what is here. And just like those type of chapters in that book really resonated with me because it's what you get out of it and how you change the way that you look at the world through your travel.
Absolutely.
And my dad worked for United for 37 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And my entire life I've been on a plane. Yeah. And so I can't stress enough how traveling can open up your mind.
You're preaching to the choir there. The opposite of you. I didn't start traveling until my 30s, and now it's 40 countries in, and
make it up.
I am making it up as much as I can, but it was that experience, from the first time where I remember just being in Europe for the first time, looking at things differently and saying, I need to see
absolutely.
much of this. What was the second book?
The second one is by Douglas Copeland, who's one of my favorite authors, fiction writers, which is Generation X. There's a couple in there, like he wrote Microserves, which was great. It's about sort of, think about Silicon Valley in a book form.
Yeah.
And that was about culture and it was about interactions between people that were working in technology. But Generation X, which is truly where that term came from, this book, Douglas Copeland really, takes again relationships between people in their 20s and really explores that in sort of a fun way. But he's really just an amazing author. One of the more recent ones that I would throw into that mix would be AI Superpowers by Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. And, he was former head of Google in China, I believe, and writes about the sort of impending challenges that the US and China are going to have with artificial intelligence. And it's sort of this new battleground. And it's just fascinating as he puts together his argument that, the US is very, very much far ahead in terms of research around AI, but China is very much far ahead of actually leveraging these huge data sets of the ether of digital products that we have and actually using that for practical applications. And so he thinks that China will very soon leapfrog the US in terms of their capabilities of leveraging data and leveraging AI. But we still have this edge when it comes to teaching people around machine learning and other applications. So it's fascinating.
I was going to start asking you questions about the book, but we'll just have to read it. Like I said, I'll link to it. As you've gotten older, what has become more important to you? Has anything become less?
I think that experiences around travel and around spending time with my family as my boys get older, and my wife reminds me all the time that, suck in this moment. Think about, the fact that they're never going to be this age again, and appreciate
that hug that you get from your 6-year-old and that, look of indifference that you have from your 9-year-old as they want to read more than, spend time with you, perhaps.
Where they don't want to give you a hug for a few years.
That's right. And so I think, that becomes more important. And I think the thing that I'm less inclined to deal with is sort of this corporate BS that we have to deal with. And that's why sort of venturing out on our own in terms of creating an opportunity to have that voice heard without, the comms people and the PR people saying you can't. I think that's important. I also want to spend much less time with people that say you can't.
Yep, that makes sense to me. There's a question I didn't send you. When you hear the word success, who's the first person that comes to mind?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know why he popped up, but Bill Gates.
Okay.
But what I think is interesting about Bill is not just he created this amazing company that now people are, because they've crossed over that $1 trillion mark, is sort of this example of resurgence. Because Nadella has done an amazing job sort of refocusing that company. It's kind of like, could have gone this direction of IBM and others and sort of, been successful, but not where they are. But with Bill, what I think is combining this ability to build and create this amazingly large, complex company and stepping out of it before, people thought he would. And then truly leveraging all of this money that he made to change the world.
I think that is the third time his name has come up and on the show, and every single time it's not about Microsoft, it's about the Gates Foundation.
That's right.
Like the idea that he built this, but then did this.
Well, I'm going to extend that to one little bit. So one of the things that I think is amazing about what the Gates Foundation has done, and it's not just about building a better toilet or providing new technologies to bring water from point A to point B more efficiently. One of the things that they have embedded in the Gates Foundation is this focus on financial inclusion.
Yep.
And just this past year, they launched a product suite of open source software that is designed around payment systems called Moolah. And what's interesting about that is that they're giving it away to the world, the source code and this ability for any entity and any government and any telco or anybody within a country to build a payment platform very similar to M-Pesa. M-Pesa has changed Eastern Africa.
Yep.
And to take your money and back up this idea that access to credit, access to storing money, and access to moving money is a significant driver of reducing people's inability to get to that next level through technology, that is significant. And that's just one piece of what they do. So, there is a financial component to saying Gates.
I had a chance to tour the Gates Foundation a few years back, and I love the idea that he takes these problems, he's like, they're solvable.
Yeah.
There's a way to do this. It's going to be, and he has the resources obviously too, which is great, but he's using them.
One of the people that are actually running the financial space within Gates, his name is Costa Peric, and he actually wrote a really small book that doesn't get enough attention, and it's called The Castle in the Sandbox.
We will have to link to that one as well, and I'm going to have to check that one out. Again, thank you so much for being on the show. The last question I have of you is, do you have any final asks or any final thoughts for our listeners today?
Yep. Just continue to embrace knowledge. Be curious, care for other people, and make sure that caring comes out in your business model. You always have to dream, and you have to, strive to make those dreams not just real for yourself, but for the people around you, including those people that maybe don't have that voice.
Perfect way to end. We will link to everything we talked about in the show notes. Is Leimer, Leimer on Twitter, the preferred way for people to reach out if they have more questions of you?
It's Leimer.
Leimer. Oh, sorry. Jeez.
You should
horrible.
Keep that in.
I should keep that, huh? Oh.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, it's Leimer.
Leimer.
So the easiest way to get a hold of me is either through Twitter on Leimer, which is Leimer, or it's Bradley at unconventionalventures.com.
Well, Brad, I apologize for mispronouncing the name in the end, but I do thank you once again for being on the show, and I hope you have a great day and a great co-op. Thank you.
Thank you so much.